everyone who is not okay. We are on.
Okay.
Hello, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Anara Tabashaliva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fetch, Dr. Chris White, and uh, uh, also our program producer, Professor Larry Shrey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post questions and comments. Quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Dr. Victor Fe.
Вітаємо наших слухачів з України глибоким уклоном. Ми є свідками ваших великих страждань, а також вашої великої сили. Дякуємо за участь у нашій щотижневій програмі.
Thank you, Victor. And today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett. And non-speakers, please turn off your cameras. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We welcome today Dr. Yuri Yarim-Agaev from United States, who will speak on the war in Ukraine as a global conflict between totalitarianism and democracy. I'm glad that we have such an illustrious speaker. Dr. Yarim-Agaev has been Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Senior Research Fellow at Stanford, MIT, Visiting Scientist in Chemistry Department at New York University, and so on. He's a scientist, but also a human rights activist, and he was a key member of the 1970s, 1980s Moscow Helsinki Group, a leading group of human rights movement in Russia, working closely with Andrei Sakharov and other famous dissidents. In 1984, he founded the Center for Democracy still in the U.S.S.R. And then by the late 80s, with Vladimir Bukovsky and Paruir Khairikyan, they founded Democracy and Independence Group, devoted to promoting the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union into new independent states. In 91, by invitation of new Russian government led by Boris Yeltsin, Dr. Yarim-Agaev developed a comprehensive program to secure the free flow of information in Russia. Welcome, Dr. Yuri Yarim-Agaev. The microphone is yours for the next 30, 40 minutes, as long as you wish to speak to us about current conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. Thank you very much, everybody who is listening to me. I gave a very general title to my presentation, which is Ukraine war as a conflict between totalitarianism and democracy. Now, I have mixed feeling about such possibly theoretical presentation in context of what's going on, because to me it's very personal. This morning I communicated with my brother and his family who are in Kyiv, and you know that today Kyiv was attacked again by many rockets. My grandnephew there was hiding in his bomb shelter, who is less than 1.5 years old, but he is used to that because actually most part of his life was during this war. So that's a situation which I feel very emotionally about, very personally, but still I believe that it's critical to understand it's in more general term and to put all this war in context. And this context is very important for not only theoretical reasons, but for purely political reasons. Because the main opposition of this war, which exists in this country and in the West in general, is because it's considered by some, and not so few, as very local war by some unknown country somewhere far away from us in which we have no interest. And that's misconception. It's complete misconception, but it has consequences because those people actually, many of them oppose any support to this war. And that's why I believe it's so important to put it in the proper context. And the context is that it's actually the global war between totalitarian alliance and a democratic alliance. So as a scientist, first of all, I need to define clearly the terms which I use. Well, Ukrainian war is clear. Now, totalitarian alliance may be less clear because this word totalitarianism is used now very indiscriminately and confused all the time with authoritarianism, which is completely different political system. And that's very unfortunate, again, not only from theoretical point of view, but it has very direct political consequences. And I can tell you, for example, that the whole foreign policy by Ronald Reagan was just built on the difference between totalitarianism and authoritarianism, and he launched his war very precisely against totalitarianism and was very successful. So what is totalitarianism? Let me formulate and remind you quickly. It is a political system in which the government controls all aspects of the life of all its citizens, and such aspects as political life, economic life, religious life, cultural life, and even private life. So actually, totalitarian systems are thrice totalitarian. First of all, because this control is absolutely penetrating and goes to the level of micromanagement. Second, because it controls everybody, started from the very top to the very bottom. And third, that as I mentioned, it controls all aspects of life. Now, for such system exists, it needs ideology, which would justify such total control. Actually, ideologies create such system. And the totalitarian ideology and the regime which is created are totalitarian socialism. Now, it's important to understand that it's always socialism. There couldn't be totalitarian capitalism because in capitalism there is a free market and totalitarian regime cannot afford anything free. So it's all totalitarian socialism, and there are three shades of totalitarian socialism. One is known as international totalitarian socialism, also known as communism, which we know best from the Soviet Union and now from China. The second shade is nationalistic totalitarian socialism, also known as Nazism, which we know from Hitler's Germany. And there is also the third form of totalitarian socialism, which is religious totalitarian socialism, which we now see in Iran in the form of Islamism, but it could be in general other religion as well. Now, this ideology, this forms, these shades of totalitarian socialism or totalitarianism are not so different from each other. And that's what allows alliance between them. And they're usually allied to each other. And there are elements of different shades in each of these systems. Even if you take Soviet communist system, it had nationalistic elements, not very international, when they, for example, exiled Chechens and Crimean Tatars, the whole nation after Second World War. And when Stalin actually launched campaign against Jews, which hasn't developed fully because of his death, but state anti-Semitism became part of the Soviet Union in late years, which is hardly internationalism by its nature. So anyway, those three forms very well coexist and cooperate. And one of the reasons they cooperate so successfully because the ideology which rules them to be have support of among people should also claim its superiority over all other forms, and which it does. And it says that only their ideology is good and the rest of the world is actually very bad. And the goal of such totalitarian states, they become missionary and very expansionist. And they have the common enemy, which is democratic world, and first and foremost, the leader of this world, the United States of America. So all the countries of totalitarian world are united in this ideological war, which they launched from the very start of totalitarianism in those countries against the common enemy, democracy, and its leader, United States of America. Now, which countries are totalitarian at the moment? On communist side, we have definitely China, the largest and most powerful communist country, North Korea, but we have still some others. We still have Vietnam, we have still Laos, we still have Cuba. So unfortunately, communism is far from being eradicated. It's the most strong totalitarian presence now in this world. Now, as I mentioned, Iran represents another totalitarian society, which is Islamism. And finally, we get to Russia. Now, Nazism seemingly disappeared with the fall of Hitler's Germany after Nuremberg trial and extensive campaign of denazification. We didn't see Nazism as a ruling regime in any country in the world. Well, neo-Nazis exist, but everywhere is kind of very small marginal groups which don't have not only political power, but actually any visible political influence. Now we come to Russia. So what happened with Russia? Russia actually, after Soviet communism collapsed in 91, Russia underwent a lot of political changes, starting from attempt to become democratic society, unfortunately very embryonic and very short-lived, then moved to authoritarianism, then moved to oligarchy, then moved with Putin coming to power. It was KGB junta first, then Putin consolidated power and it became authoritarian rule by Putin. And now, finally, Russia for last years moved again to totalitarianism. Well, what is interesting was Putin. Putin first actually dismissed ideology and didn't want to involve ideology in his rule. But gradually, and he succeeded without it as long as he had enough revenues from oil and gas, and as long as country developed economically successfully in comparison with communism, which was not difficult to do because communism was the bottom in economic sense. And but gradually it's ended, I mean, and there was not much what he could offer in terms of improving and increasing material well-being of his people, and he turned to ideology. He felt that he needed ideology. Now, what ideology? Definitely there were a lot of remnants of communism in Russia. Well, first of all, the old generation pretty much remained Soviet generation as it was, and still like in communism. Actually, the second party in the Russian parliament was always Communist Party, which also bared. And there was a lot of symbolism and other things which Putin restored from pure communist past, such as national anthem and hammer and sickle and whatever else. But to fully declare communism again as a ruling ideology was not very promising thing, because actually it collapsed already and it was not as strong as it was before. So Putin decided to mix it with other totalitarian ideology, and here came to the help all Russian nationalism, which he blended with communism and with, well, which is essentially Nazism. So Putin was successful in restoring Nazism in Russia, which was first time after the end of the Second World War. And finally, he also involved religion, you know, the Orthodox Russian religions, which was always subordinate to him. So here is a religious element. So he created kind of hybrid on all three forms of totalitarian ideology of communism, Nazism, and religious totalitarian socialism. And here what it happens in Russia now. That's what Russia is. So it became totalitarian country. Well, hybrid totalitarian doesn't matter. And it's immediately joined totalitarian alliance. Actually, it started to join it even before it. The first foreign trips by Putin were to China and North Korea when he became president still in year 2000. Which was quite demonstrative. Not many people paid attention to that, but that's what exactly happened. Well, definitely further and further, his ties with China, North Korea, and Iran increased, and they became very close friends and patriots. And again, Putin helped Iran with development of its nuclear weapon, and there were many other connections between them. Well, again, the main thing was that they were united in ideological war against the West, against democracy, and all of them considered America its main enemy. China didn't advertise it so much, but it always was part of Chinese doctrine that America remained its main enemy. Well, Iran called it Great Satan, and in Russia, anti-Americanism for last years became essentially the foundation of Putin's power. He spoke about it. He blamed America in everything. He said that it's decaying society which should disappear, and etc., etc. So it was classical totalitarian alliance, and which actually strengthened its ties before this war, and Putin met with Chinese leader Xi shortly before the war, and they pledged mutual support, and actually support without limits, as they said it. He reiterated his close ties with Iran. So the totalitarian alliance seemed before this war very strong and very united. Now, I cannot say it about democratic alliance, unfortunately, because there wasn't so much unity between democratic countries as it was in totalitarian alliance. Also, democratic alliances showed many weaknesses, both in mutual relation, but also vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And with the coming of Biden administration, this victims was most clear and evident in defeat in Afghanistan, where America virtually ran away from that country, leaving its weapons, leaving many people, etc. So democratic alliance seemed before the war to be weak and disunited. Now, here comes Ukraine. And that's very important because, as I said, as we'll see, Ukraine became a very important part of that alliance, but not immediately and not actually before the war. Now, what Ukraine and Russia split completely in their developments after first democratic revolution in Ukraine, which was called Orange Revolution. Now, from that time on, Ukraine started to develop in democratic direction, while Russia started to move to totally opposite totalitarian directions, and they started to go apart more and more. Second, well, there was brief restoration of Yanukovych's power after first revolution, but Fortunately, what remained after the first revolution, democratic revolution in Ukraine, is free press, which allowed for the second so-called Euromaidan, which further developed Ukraine in democratic direction. Now, Putin cannot stand it. Putin, if there is any record of Putin achievements, it's only one. During all his presidency, he fought democratic movements and supported dictatorship all around the world. That's his actually one and only thing, that what he was trained to do as a KGB officer. He hates democracy, he supports dictatorship, and he couldn't stand Ukraine develop in this direction, and he felt absolutely essential to suppress democratic revolution. So he did partially. He annexed Crimea in 2014, and he went to occupy Donbass. And his main intention at that force was actually to stop development of democratic revolution in Ukraine. The credit which he received for annexation of Crimea actually came as a consequence of it, but it was not the initial purpose. And not even extension Russian Empire, but stop and suppress democratic revolution by all means. So he partially succeeded. If not for his actions, democracy in Ukraine would have developed even further and deeper, but only partially. Ukraine still continued to go in the same direction, and Putin felt threatened. Now, so what happened immediately before this war? As we already said, on one hand, Putin felt strong totalitarian alliance behind his back. On the other hand, he saw a weak democratic alliance. And one thing I also want to mention, that if Ukraine wanted to join the democratic alliance was not so eager to accept it. Actually, Ukraine tried to join European Union, NATO, and by all other means to increase their ties with Western democracy, but Western democracy was very cautious. So Ukraine was even not fully accepted to this alliance before the war, and the alliance, democratic alliance as such, was quite weak. Now, so that was good enough and Putin yet felt threatened. And that was the third very important thing, and actually the main thing which pushed him to this war. Now, by what was he threatened? He felt surrounded. Well, definitely, officially, for Russian people, for everybody, he said that he is surrounded by NATO, and Russia is surrounded by NATO, which can attack it at any moment. But actually, what surrounded Putin were democratic developments around him and inside this country. I want to remind you that shortly before this war, there was democratic revolution in Belarus, the closest and the most reliable ally of Putin. Now, this democratic revolution was suppressed with the help of Putin by Lukashenko, but not eliminated, and definitely these processes within Belarus remained. Now, after that, we saw such revolution very short-lived, though, but also not completely disappearing, in Kazakhstan. Okay, another country. Now, inside Russia, the Navalny opposition movement became quite stronger. And again, although it was suppressed and is suppressed at the moment, nothing of that disappeared. And at the same time, Ukraine continued to develop in democratic and pro-Western direction. So Putin felt be surrounded by these democratic developments, and he is afraid, he hates them. So he felt, and his last hope was Ukraine with so-called Minsk agreement and Norman process also failed, and that he decided that the only way to save his power, and he actually cared about his power, that his power is threatened, is to attack and to actually conquer all Ukraine. Now, he counted on one thing, because he felt strong and he was sure that his army was strong, which definitely was big mistake as many others, and that he has strong totalitarian alliance behind him, and the West is very weak, and the West doesn't want support Ukraine. So he hoped for the very fast, actually several days or 1 week victory with virtually no losses like it was in Crimea virtually, which would definitely strengthen and consolidate his power. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen only because Ukraine. And it was the most unexpected part of this equation. Because West was not eager to resist Putin's invasion. And actually, they offered immediately Zelensky to surrender and leave the country. But Ukrainian army and Ukrainian people decided otherwise. And that was started to change and turn the whole tide. And Ukraine showed incredible resistance. West had no choice, and quite unwillingly in the beginning, to support it, and more accept into its alliance. And this alliance started to strengthen thanks to Ukraine. Actually, what started to happen is strange thing. The Democratic Alliance, which was very weak seemingly, and well, actually, before this war, started to get stronger and stronger, more consolidated and more united. NATO, Europe, and America united. More than that, Finland and Sweden joined NATO. Everybody agreed on supporting Ukraine, on increasing this support. And the stronger Ukraine showed itself, the stronger it became kind of leader of this democratic alliance, the more it was accepted into it, and the stronger this democratic alliance started. Now, the opposite thing happened with the totalitarian alliance. Putin didn't even get very enthusiastic support by his closest internal allies, such as Belarus and Kazakhstan, who were not willing to directly participate in this war and still don't. With China, the situation also turned a little bit sour. China didn't provide any material help and even called for some restraint Putin, particularly when he started to threaten with nuclear weapons. Well, Iran possibly is the only country which still continues to help Russia with weapons, with, as we know, with drones and missiles. But that is not what Putin expected. So Putin miscalculated not only vis-a-vis Ukraine itself, but in this more global context, because as I say, Democratic Alliance became much more consolidated and strong, while Totalitarian Alliance didn't show much unity at all. Well, we can hope that it will continue and China wouldn't start to help Russia with weapons, which it has in abundance, and which would be very dramatic and bad situation. But hopefully not. And one of the reasons which I may assume why China behaves this way is because all those strong leaders and strong totalitarian countries, they don't like losers. And as Putin threw under the bus Yanukovych when he lost Euromaidan, also Yanukovych was his man and it was strong alliance. But when Yanukovych lost, Putin actually abandoned him. So my feeling, but that's also only feeling, I cannot confirm it more precisely, with such reluctance on Chinese part to support Putin, that they consider him more and more as a loser, and they don't want to support loser. And if that continues, it's dramatic situation, and it's terrible blow to Putin. So anyway, what happened as in this situation? That Putin declared his war actually not to Ukraine, but to the America. And he actually did it openly. And he continues to say that this is war against America, against NATO. And he treats Ukraine only as part of this alliance, or even the territory on which the war against NATO is going on. So to Putin, it's absolutely proxy war and against NATO and the West. And as we say, if he talks as a duck and walks as a duck, he is a duck. So if he talks that he fights against America, if he continues to do it, if he threatens the West with nuclear weapon, mind you, not only Ukraine, but America as well. That's his words, which are very important, and the nuclear threat is actually more than words. But in terms of actions, as I say, Putin, and as I told, in terms of words, Putin put anti-Americanism as a foundation of his power inside Russia, and always speaks about it, that our main enemy is America, we fight against America, etc. In terms of action, Putin also for many years carries very hostile actions against America and the West, and we saw it with his interference with elections, with some cyber attacks, and with many other actions which are direct hostile action against our country. So yes, to him it is a war against the West and against democratic alliance in general. And we cannot ignore this fact, because any war is two-sided street. That if one country launches war against you, you cannot pretend that they don't fight you. They're not carrying out war against you. So we are in this war. This is a proxy war to us. And all burden is on Ukraine, because nobody on our side except for Ukraine participates in this war. And we should be grateful that Ukraine actually assumes such incredible burden on itself and give it full support. Now, what is important that if we establish context of this war as a proxy war between democracy and totalitarianism, and see Ukraine as our in this situation, first of all, it removes immediately all major objections against supporting Ukraine. The first question, when some people like Tucker Carlson ask, why should we support Ukraine rather than Russia? Well, the answer to this question is straightforward, because Russia is our enemy and Ukraine is our friend and ally. That Russia has fighting a war against us and Ukraine for us. So that's automatic. I mean, it's nothing to discuss about it. Now, there is another question, objection, that it's like, as I said, local war in some remote country. Why should we care? No, it's not local war, as I said. It's immediate. It's a part of this global war, and war was launched mainly against us and against all Western alliance. Now, the third objection, typical objection by mainly conservatives, but some other people as well, is that, well, we shouldn't care much about Ukraine because it's not very civilized. Most of all, it's not democratic. It's corrupted country, and it doesn't share any value with us. So what should we have to do with it? Now, first of all, most of that is direct lie. And it's democratic country. It's not much corrupted country. and it's a very civilized country. But second, when we put Ukraine in the context of global war, we should talk about all the things, comparing them to other proxy wars. And we had such wars in Korea, we had such war in Vietnam, we had similar wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and in which we were directly involved. And if we start to compare Ukraine with all those allies which we had, we would see that we get ideal ally, ideal country to support, which we never had before. I mean, in terms of democracy, definitely in comparison with South Vietnam or Iraq or whatever else, it's the most democratic country. It definitely has much less corruption. Compare the government. Afghan president, whom we supported and created to a great extent, fled the country and second day after Taliban started its offensive. Zelensky, who was offered to leave the country safely, stayed and actually headed resistance of this country to Russia. And finally, Ukrainian army. You cannot compare this army to either South Vietnamese army or to Iraqi or to Afghans army. Now, all these armies, except for Ukraine, had absolute support by America, including American troops there on the ground and all American pomade. And they fought very poorly even with that support. But when that support was removed, they collapsed, as we saw in Afghanistan. The next day, American left, the whole Afghan army, which we created before, disappeared. Now, with Ukraine, we have exactly opposite. Ukraine doesn't have any direct support by NATO or United States. And it fights against much more stronger army, which is Russia's, and it was Taliban or some Iraqi military groups. And it showed himself exceptionally strong and exceptionally well. So what I'm saying, we have ideal ally. And well, let me mention to comparison, the final comparison, what it gets to allies whom we supported. As long as those countries are allies, we gave them full support. And the most extreme example is Second World War II, when our ally was Stalin's communist Soviet Union. Well, which we definitely could not even seriously talk about democracy and everything else when we talk about that country, the most terrible country in the world. Still, as long as it was our ally was supported it, was heavily, was all lend-lease, all equipment, military, and etc., etc., etc. So there is absolutely no reason to not to give to Ukraine absolutely full support in this war, and to make everything possible for its victory. Because Ukrainian victory, is our victory. And Ukrainian loss would be our loss. And that should be very clear. And we cannot afford more losses. We lost too much. Actually, the time has come for democratic alliance to get again in offensive against totalitarian world, as it did in Reagan's time, and very successfully. And it very much depends on these results of this war. And if Ukraine wins in this war, and I hope sincerely it wins, and we should give all the support for that victory, it will be victory of the whole democratic alliance and the defeat for totalitarian alliance. And it will start the move, much greater move by democracy over this globe, and eventual collapse of totalitarianism, which I believe can come very soon. And that's, I think I finished that a little bit longer than I thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yarim-Agaev. This was Yuri Yarim-Agaev talking to us with probably the most lucid analysis of the war I have heard in our 44 weeks of this weekly podcast. thank you once again. This was brilliant, and personally, I side with you completely, and I will give microphone to our guests for possible questions. Guests and panel, please. We have time.
I have question. Thank you very much for your excellent and comprehensive presentation. As historian, I enjoyed, and I think it's would be tremendously important for our students. My question is that when we look at Russia, and many observers today mention a lack of unity within anti-Putin opposition. And my question: why is Russia's Russian opposition is fragmented and so indecisive? And the second question: do any opposition leaders have any plan or effective good plan for ending war and post-conflict reconstruction?
Well, when you say why opposition is not so active, well, opposition is, I would say, quite active. The problem is that it's repressed totally. Whoever becomes active inside Russia, as you know, goes almost immediately to prison. And we have already many people, more than 1,000 people, who actively oppose this war, who are in jail and given quite long terms. Now, with opposition in general, well, actually, I would say that real opposition in Russia starts with Navalny. Whatever was before him and whatever still exists of previous times, I would never call real opposition, and I know those people very well. They themselves called they call themselves loyal opposition, which is oxymoron actually, because and they never tried actually to get to power. They never tried to gain massive support. It was more kind of intellectual front which Putin tolerated and which couldn't make much difference. And also some of them were at power before Putin, and they didn't do much, So they are pretty much losers, people who already don't have much support and respect and couldn't do much in Russia. So we should consider emergence of new opposition, and as I say, it started with Navalny, and it's pretty large movement, greatly suppressed at the moment. The people who are inside, many are in prisons, many people left the country, but it continues. And I'm sure that new opposition would arise. It's the process. The weaker Putin's power would become, the more split would be within this power, the more opposition would occur in this country. And I strongly believe that the victory in this war by Ukraine, and I'm almost certain that it will be Ukrainian victory, automatically means the end of Putin's regime. And I mean not Putin personally, I mean much broader. The fall of the whole group of people who are in power, of this old KGB people and new authoritarian, totalitarian people, and there would be a lot of room for Russia to move in democratic direction after that. Only during that time, new leaders and new opposition can emerge. So we shouldn't be very pessimistic that we don't see much at the moment. I'm sure that this process will develop.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anara. Any more questions, please? Guests and panel, please. I can see Yefim Somin raising his hand. Please, Yefim, unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Yarim-Agaev, for a very comprehensive presentation. I just want to add a little bit on this on a bit of a lighter note. I yesterday watched Dave Letterman's My Next Guest Needs No Introduction with Vladimir Zelensky, who definitely didn't need any introduction, and it was very impressive. For anybody who hasn't seen it yet, I very much recommend it. It's on Netflix. It's about an hour long. One thing I want to mention from there, Zelensky actually told a relatively, apparently a recent joke, which matches very well with Dr. Yarim-Agaev's presentation today. So two Jews meet in Odessa, and they start talking about the war. And one says, yeah, so there is a war between Ukraine and NATO. Yes. So what about you? I'm sorry, between Russia and NATO. Sorry about that. So what about Russia? Well, Russia lost tens of thousands of people killed, and so many tanks and so many airplanes and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And what about NATO? Well, NATO hasn't arrived yet.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions, please? Our guests and panel, please, if you want to ask more questions. I would ask myself within the same vein as Anara said about the opposition. Dr. Yarim-Agaev, do you think that people now organizing themselves, famous names like Mikhail Khodorkovsky and others, organizing all kinds of alliances abroad in exile, would they have any opportunity or influence if things go the best way?
No, I don't think so. I don't think, as I say, it's yesterday. It's people of yesterday. Was Khodorkovsky and Garry Kasparov, whom I long time ago actually helped brought into politics still in the end of 80s. They had their chance. They had their chance, and they had their power, and some of them were actually part of this power. They didn't use it. They, being in a position for many years and being allowed to be in a position, they failed to organize any strong resistance to power. And actually, they even didn't claim attempt to come to power instead of Putin. And there was a weak part. So I don't think that most of these people will play any important role in Russia. I actually count more on new young generation, and Navalny actually started this movement, but it's not only Navalny. Generational situation in terms of opposition changed. If you look at Bolotnaya, it was mainly our generation which was present there. It was people from who resisted the Soviet communism in last years of the Soviet communism and who didn't want to return of totalitarian regime. But young generation at that time, unfortunately, was very passive. It didn't participate much. So the most dramatic change in recent years, I would say maybe 5 or 7 years, was that the young generation became active. So I expect most opposition grow and develop from this young generation, most names of which we don't know yet, but they will come. So that's my main hope, not the people of the past, that's what I think.
Thank you so much. Please, I'm asking for more questions.
Okay.
Dr. Deutsch, please.
I have one. What do you make of Putin's claim that Russia is fighting fascism, and what kind of resonance does that have within Russia itself? To what degree do the Russian people believe that?
Well, first of all, about claim, it's the most ridiculous claim you can make because, as I say, the only country in which Nazism is now in power, although in hybrid form, as I said, is Russia. So the last country which can fight Nazism on this planet is Russia, because it's the only country which can be called Nazist country. And there was no, well, first, I don't like also the mixing of terms, as I say, as authoritarianism and totalitarianism, as well as fascism and Nazism, which are also totally different things. But anyway, there is no fascism and no Nazism in Ukraine. Now, as to Russians, do they believe it? Look, there is unfortunately big part of Russians who believe everything. How it may contradict any logic, it may contradict any facts, it may contradict anything, you know. But if Putin says it or television says it, so far, unfortunately, many people continue to believe it. Now, this can dissipate very fast, you know, with more Russian defeats, with more successful action with Ukraine, and with more Russian people forcibly sent to fight this war and being killed there, and this process spreading all around the country, it can change 180 degrees at any moment, I can assure you. It's very superficial support in a sense. It has no depth in it. But so far, unfortunately, you know, as I say, whatever television says, whatever Putin says, they believe. Now, what is interesting is that there starts some split. I mean, if TV and Putin were very monotonous and unanimous, I would say, until very recently. Now we start to see some split even in official or allowed channels of communication. And ironically, this split comes not from democratic and liberal side so far, which is very suppressed, but from more nationalistic part, who accuses Russian government, still not mentioning Putin personally, of defeats in this war, of weakness of Russian army, etc. Now, they want conquer Ukraine. They want stronger army. So their position is not very nice and good. But in criticizing Putin, they reveal the real problems of this war, because they speak openly about how bad the Russian army, how strong is Ukrainian army, how many Ukrainian army has victories, and that contradicts all previous Putin's propaganda, which always claims that Russia is only winning, that everything is going along the plan, etc. So this split is also important, and the more differences will become in official Soviet propaganda, the more dissonance will appear there. Well, the less people would believe it, because it's hard to determine to what to believe. So this process will continue to develop also.
I have a question.
Yes, Larry, please.
Recently, there's been a lot of controversy regarding Angela Merkel's statements regarding the Minsk agreement, how it was never really meant to maintain the peace, but rather to provide some time for Ukraine to get armed. What is your take on that? Do you think that's true? Putin's been using that a lot for propaganda over the last few days.
No, I don't think it's true. First of all, let's say what the Minsk agreement was a complete invention by Putin, which unfortunately was supported by France and Germany and America also. Now, the purpose of Minsk agreement, and this was the following. Putin wanted to establish his power in Donbass. He wanted so-called autonomy of Donbass, which actually meant more than autonomy, which meant that it would be his Plattsdarm, his territory when he would establish his power. And he wanted Donbass to stay the part of Ukraine. Why? Because he wanted to have not only his power in Donbass, but representation of this power in Ukrainian government, right? So in Rada will be deputies from Donbass region, which would be who will be totally controlled by Putin. So to him, this plan was to have through autonomous Donbass to have leverage or lever over the whole Ukraine. So yeah, well, Ukraine was unwilling from the very beginning. Actually, Ukraine Rada and Ukraine Parliament, Ukrainian presidents tried to do something, but very unwillingly and procrastinated. But on the side of the West, I don't think so that they use it simply to give Ukraine time to arm. No, they actually wanted it, and they pushed for it all the time. And Merkel pushed, and then there was so-called formula of Stockmeyer, who is president of the Germany. No, actually, they twisted Ukrainian hands, and they wanted Ukraine to sign and actually to surrender. Look, until Ukraine started to resist seriously, and even the first day of the war, the first weeks of the war, all the West, Europe and America also wanted Ukrainian surrender. That was their policy. They wanted Ukraine to give to Russia definitely all Crimea and Donbass and maybe some conquered territories already by Russia after February 23. And if not Ukrainian, if they themselves wouldn't deny all that and show extremely strong resistance, no. The West didn't care if Ukraine was occupied at that moment.
Thank you very much. We are now, obviously, very soon will be 10 months of the war. And my question, if nobody has more, what is your prospect? Do you see any end game here? We understand that all depends on how strongly West will support militarily on the battlefield. Do you see any development here?
Well, I agree with you that it very much and mainly depends on how strongly West will be supported. Actually, to me, there is no excuse for such a weak support. I don't know why West doesn't provide all necessary weapons to Ukraine. I don't understand why West intentionally modifies even HIMARS weapon to be used only for short distance, not more than 70, 75 kilometers. Actually, repeating the mistake of Vietnam War, as we remember, right? When the war was fought in a very strange way, when Viet Cong attacked all the time southern Vietnam and then retreated back, but nobody could follow Viet Cong and nobody could do anything with North Vietnam, right? So it's about the same approach now. Russia can attack, and this morning, the airplanes, bombers, actually flew from all Russian airfields and bombed dozens of Ukrainian cities. But Ukraine should be given a weapon, to hit those airfields from Russia regular attacks. So I don't have any excuses for that. I think it's stupid. It shouldn't happen. Ukraine, West should provide all weapons to Ukraine, and I will push, and I think many of us will push for it, and I hope it will gradually increase and increase. They already promised Patriots missile at least. Now, actually, I don't see any reason why NATO wouldn't close the sky over Ukraine, because if we turn to all previous conflicts, it was never considered a direct war against the Soviet Union when American airplanes would fight Soviet airplanes over Vietnam or Korea or any other country. It was considered standard procedure, pretty much. Actually, when Turkey shot Russian airplanes over Syria, Russia didn't say anything. So I don't see why America doesn't do that. Anyway, I still believe that Ukraine win. Ukraine seems not to agree, and I understand it, to any concession in terms of territory. To Ukraine, victory still means returning all territories, including Donbass and Crimea. And I think Ukraine will continue to fight for that. And I think that eventually it has more and more influence on the West, and West would more and more accept these terms. Now, definitely, if Ukraine achieves it, as I said, Putin's regime would collapse. It would be absolute defeat to Putin's regime. And I believe in that happens. And again, I'm writing now a very long article concerning American conservatives on the side of libertarians and MAGA Republicans, which is main resistance for stronger support, and that's what I'm trying to do here, it somehow influences ridiculous and absolutely absurd objections to such support. And I think that's what we can do to help Ukraine here in the United States.
Thank you so much again for your analysis. Unfortunately, what we said on this panel back in March still remains more than true, that this war is global. It is so important for the United States and the entire world, and we want people to watch and pay attention, and this is why we're here. I will conclude with our traditional address to our Ukrainian viewers. Дорогі брати і сестри України, ми тримаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог береже вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня ми прощаємось. Слава Україні! Героям
Слава
слава!
Україні!
Glory to Ukraine. God bless Ukraine. God bless America. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We stopped recording. We're still here. So if somebody has